Court attention. Superior Court number 11 of the State of New York, Honorable Judge William Heath presiding.
The people of the State of New York versus Karen Andre.
Ready, Your Honor.
Ready, Your Honor.
Bailiff, draw a jury.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are to be the jurors in this case. Kindly take your seat and receive instructions from Judge Heath.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are the jurors who are to try this case. At its close, you will retire to the jury room and vote upon your verdict. I instruct you to listen carefully to the testimony and pronounce your judgment accordingly to the best of your ability and integrity. You are to determine whether the defendant is guilty or not guilty. Her fate rests in your hands. The district attorney may now proceed.
Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, on the 16th of January, near midnight, when the lights of Broadway blazed an electric dawn over the gay crowds below, the body of the man came hurtling through space and crashed, a disfigured mess, at the foot of the Faulkner building. The body was Sweden's great financier, Bjorn Faulkner. He fell 50 stories from his luxurious penthouse apartment. A suicide, or so we were told. A great man, unwilling to bend before his imminent ruin. A man who found the fall from the roof of a skyscraper shorter and easier than his descent from his tottering throne as the world's financial dictator. Only a few months ago, behind every big transaction of gold in the world, stood that well-known figure. Young, tall, with an arrogant smile, with kingdoms and nations in the palm of one hand and a whip in the other. If gold is the world's lifeblood, then Bjorn Faulkner, holding all its dark hidden arteries, regulating its ebbs, flows, its every pulsation, was the heart of the world. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the world has just had a heart attack. And like all heart attacks, it was rather sudden. No one suspected the gigantic swindle that lay at the foundation of the Faulkner enterprises. A few days after his death, the earth shook at the crash of his business. Thousands of investors were stricken with the paralysis that often follows an attack, when that monstrous heart stopped beating. Bjorn Faulkner had had a hard struggle facing the world, but he had a much harder struggle to face his own heart, a struggle which this trial will have to uncover. Two women ruled his life and death. Here is one of them, ladies and gentlemen, Karen Andre, Faulkner's efficient secretary and notorious mistress. But 6 months ago, Faulkner came to America to get a loan and save his fortune. Fate had sent him a means to save his own heart in the person of the lovely girl who is now his widow, Nancy Lee Faulkner, the only daughter of John Graham Whitfield, our great philanthropist. Faulkner thought he had found salvation and a new life in the virtuous innocence of his young bride. And the best proof of it is that 2 weeks after his wedding, he dismissed his secretary, Karen Andre. He was through with her. But, ladies and gentlemen, one is not easily through with a woman like Karen Andre. We can only guess at what hatred and revenge smoldered in her heart, but they leaped into flames on the night of January 16th. Bjorn Faulkner did not kill himself. He was murdered. Murdered by the very delicate and capable hands that you see before you. The hands that helped to raise Bjorn Faulkner high over the world. The hands that threw him down from as great a heights to crash into the pavement as cold as this woman's heart. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what we're going to prove. Our first witness will be Dr. Kirkland.
Dr. Kirkland. Kindly raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do. Kindly state your name.
Thomas Kirkland,
And what is your occupation?
medical examiner of this county.
In the course of your duty, what were you called upon to do on the night of January 16th?
I was called to examine the body of Bjorn Faulkner,
And what did you find?
a body mangled to an extreme degree.
What did you establish as the cause of death?
A fall from a great height.
How long had Mr. Faulkner been dead when you examined the body?
I reached it about half an hour after the fall.
Judging by the condition of the body, could you say exactly how long it had been dead?
No, I could not. Owing to the cold weather, the blood had coagulated immediately, which makes a difference of several hours impossible to detect.
Therefore, it is possible that Faulkner had been dead longer than a half an hour.
It is possible.
Could his death have been caused by anything other than the fall?
I found no evidence of it.
For instance, had his skull been broken before the fall, would you be able to determine by examining the body?
No, owing to the condition of the body, it would be impossible to determine.
That's all, Doctor.
Did you find any trace of any such earlier wound in your examination of the body, Dr. Kirkland?
No, I did not.
Did you find any indication that death might have been caused by anything other than the fall?
No, I did not.
That is all.
John Hutchins.
John Hutchins. John Hutchins. Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, sir, I do.
What is your name
John Joseph Hutchins.
and your occupation?
I'm the night watchman at the Faulkner building.
Did Mr. Faulkner have business offices in that building?
Yes, sir.
Do you know who owned the penthouse or the roof of that building?
Certainly, sir. Mr. Faulkner did.
And who lived there?
Well, Mr. Faulkner and Miss Andre. That is before Mr. Faulkner got married.
And after the marriage?
After the marriage, Miss Andre lived there alone, sir.
Have you ever seen Mr. Faulkner calling to Miss Andre after the marriage?
Only once, sir,
And that was?
on the night of January 16th.
Tell us about it, Mr. Hutchins.
Well, it was about 10:30.
How do you know the time?
Oh, I come on duty at 10, sir, and it was no more than half an hour later. The entrance doorbell rang, and I went down to open it, and it was Miss Andre, and Mr. Faulkner was with her. I was kind of surprised because Miss Andre has her own key, and she usually lets herself in.
Was she alone with Mr. Faulkner?
No, sir. There were two other gentlemen with them.
And who were they?
I don't know, sir.
Have you ever seen them before?
No, sir, never.
What did they look like?
They were tall, sort of on the slender side. One of them had light eyes, as I remember, and the other, I couldn't see his face on account of his hat was all crooked across his eyes. He seemed like he had a bit much, though, if meaning no disrespect.
Just what do you mean?
He was a bit tight, sir, if I'm permitted to say so. He wasn't very steady on his feet. Mr. Faulkner and the other gentleman had to help him into the elevator. They almost dragged him in.
Did Mr. Faulkner look worried?
Oh, no, sir. On the contrary, he seemed quite happy.
Did he look like a man contemplating suicide?
We object, Your Honor.
Objection sustained.
Did he look like a man contemplating suicide?
We object, Your Honor.
Objection sustained.
Did the others in the party seem happy, too?
Yes, sir. Miss Andre was smiling, and Mr. Faulkner, he laughed going up in the elevator.
Did you see any of them leave that night?
Yes, sir. About 15 minutes later.
And who was that?
The drunken one, sir. He came down in the elevator alone. He didn't seem quite so drunk no more. He could walk, but he staggered a bit.
Did you see where he went?
Well, I wanted to help him to the door, seeing the condition he was in, but he saw me coming and he hurried right out. He got into a car, it was parked right at the entrance. Boy, did he step on it. I don't think he got too far, though. I think the cops got him.
What makes you think that?
Well, there was another car that took off right after him.
What car?
If Miss Andre will let me do the questioning, I may satisfy her curiosity. I was just going to ask what car, Mr. Hutchins.
It was a big black sedan, sir. It was parked just 2 cars away from him.
Who was in it?
I saw only one man.
Well, what makes you think that he was after the first car?
Well, I couldn't be sure. It just seemed funny the way that they both took off together like that.
Did you see that other guest of Miss Andre leaving, too?
I guess it was no more than 10 minutes.
And what did he do?
Nothing strange, sir. He hurried right out.
And then what happened?
Well, then I started on my rounds, sir. I guess it was maybe an hour later, I heard this screaming coming from the street. And I rushed down to the lobby and, well, I saw Miss Andre running out of the elevator. Her dress was all torn and she was sobbing like wild. Well, I went after her and we pushed through the crowd and there was Mr. Faulkner all over the pavement.
What did Miss Andre do?
She fell to her knees and screamed. It was horrible, sir. I've never seen a body smashed like that before.
That is all, Mr. Hutchins.
You said that you'd never seen Mr. Faulkner calling on Miss Andre after his marriage, with the exception of that night. Now tell me, do you always see every visitor who comes into the building at night?
No, sir. I'm not in the lobby all the time. I have my rounds to make. And if a guest has a key, well, they can let themselves in and I never see them.
In other words, Miss Andre might have had any number of visitors, Mr. Faulkner included, whom you never saw come in?
Yes, sir. That's true.
That is all.
Homer Van Fleet.
Homer Van Fleet. Kindly raise your right hand. You solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Your name.
Homer Herbert Van Fleet,
Occupation.
private investigator,
What was your last assignment?
shadowing Mr. Bjorn Faulkner,
By whom were you hired to do it?
by Mrs. Bjorn Faulkner.
Were you shadowing Mr. Faulkner the night of January 16th?
I was.
Kindly tell us about it.
I'll begin with 6:13 p.m. exactly.
Well, how did you know the time, Mr. Van Fleet?
Part of my duties. I record it and report to Mrs. Faulkner.
I see.
6:13 p.m. Mr. Faulkner leaves home on Long Island, wears formal dress suit, drives a car himself, alone. A special notation. Unusual speed all the way to New York.
Where does Mr. Faulkner go?
He drives up to the Faulkner building and goes in. It is now 7:57. All offices are closed. I wait outside in my car. 9:35 p.m., Mr. Faulkner comes out with Miss Andre. Miss Andre is dressed formally. Special notation, Miss Andre is wearing a corsage of orchids of unusual proportions. They drive away.
Where did they go?
No one is perfect in this world.
What do you mean?
I mean, I lost track of them because of Mr. Faulkner's speed and because of an accident.
What accident?
My left fender crashing into a truck. Damages for which fender charged to Mrs. Faulkner.
What did you do when you lost track of them?
I went back to the Faulkner building and waited.
And when did they return?
10:30 p.m. exactly. A gray coupe follows them. Mr. Faulkner gets out and helps Miss Andre. While she rings the bell, he opens the door of the gray coupe. A tall gentleman steps out, and together they help out a third gentleman, the latter wearing a gray sport coat. Special notation, the aforementioned gentleman shows signs of inebriation. They all go into the Faulkner building.
Then what did you do?
I left my car. I went into Gary's Grill across the street from the Faulkner's building. I must explain that I allow myself nourishment every 4 hours while I'm on duty. It had been 4 hours since we left Long Island. So I sat at a window and I observed the Faulkner building entrance.
And what did you observe?
Nothing. For 15 minutes. Then the man in the gray coat came out and got into the car, the gray coupe. He obviously was in a hurry. He got in and started it and drove south.
Did you see the other stranger leave?
Yes, 10 minutes later. He got into the car, which was at the side of the curb. I don't know how it got there, but it was there nonetheless. He must have had the keys because he got in, it started, and he drove south.
Have you ever seen Mr. Faulkner with these two men before?
No, first time I'd seen him.
What did you do when they left?
I waited. Mr. Faulkner was alone in the penthouse now with Miss Andre. I was curious, professionally speaking. I decided to do a little more investigation. I have a special observation post. I had used it before.
And where is that?
The Skytop, nightclub, roof of the Brooks building, 3 doors down from the Faulkner building. There's an open gallery off the dance floor. You go out and you can see Faulkner's penthouse as clear as the palm of my hand. I go out, I look, and I yell.
What did you see?
No light. Karen Andre's white gown shimmering in the moonlight. She is hoisting a man's body up on the parapet. A man dressed in evening clothes, Faulkner. He is unconscious. No resistance. She pushes him with all her strength up onto the parapet. He goes over, down, into space.
Then what did you do?
I run back to the dining room and I yell what I'd seen. The crowd follows me out to the Faulkner building. We see the bloody mess on the pavement. Miss Andre sobbing over it. Fit to move a first-night audience.
Did you speak to her?
No, the police arrive and I explained what I had seen, just as I've done to you here.
Your witness.
Mr. Van Fleet, can you kindly tell us when you started in the employ of Mrs. Faulkner?
October 13th last.
Can you tell us the date of Mr. and Mrs. Faulkner's wedding?
October 12th, the day before.
Exactly. Just the day before. In other words, Mrs. Faulkner hired you to spy on her husband the day after their wedding?
So it seems.
What were Mrs. Faulkner's instructions when you were hired?
To watch every action of Mr. Faulkner and report in detail.
Any special attention to Miss Andre?
Not specified.
Had Mr. Faulkner been calling on Miss Andre after his marriage?
Oh yes, frequently.
In the daytime?
Seldom.
Did you report that to Mrs. Faulkner?
I did.
What was Mrs. Faulkner's reaction to these reports?
Mrs. Faulkner is a lady, and as such, she has no reactions.
Did she seem worried?
I don't believe so. Mr. Faulkner was the most devoted of husbands. He loved his wife dearly.
Just how do you know that?
Those were Mrs. Faulkner's own words.
Mr. Van Fleet, can you tell us exactly what time you started for the Skytop nightclub on the night of January 16th?
11:32 exactly.
How long a walk is it from the Faulkner building to the Skytop?
3 minutes.
What time did you come out onto the balcony?
11:57.
So it took you exactly 25 minutes to get to the Skytop balcony. What were you doing the rest of the time?
Of course. Well, there is a dance floor at the Skytop and other things.
Did you take advantage of the other things?
Well, I just had a couple of drinks, if I understand the drift of your curiosity. But it does not mean that you can think that I was intoxicated.
Oh, I've said nothing of the kind, as yet. Now then, you saw Miss Andre pushing Mr. Faulkner off the roof, and it was a little distance away and in the darkness, and you were, well, shall we say you just had a couple of drinks?
The drinks had nothing to do with it.
Are you quite certain that she was pushing him? Isn't it possible that she was struggling with him?
It's a funny way of struggling. If I were hoisting a man up by his... Well, I wouldn't be hoisting him, I mean.
Mr. Van Fleet, what were Mrs. Faulkner's instructions before you came here to testify?
I received no instructions of any kind. I must inform you, Mrs. Faulkner is not here to instruct me if she were so inclined. She has gone to California with her father to rest her shattered nerves.
Mr. Van Fleet, do you think that Jorn Faulkner's suicide is very flattering to Mrs. Faulkner?
We object.
Objection sustained.
Mr. Van Fleet, can you tell us what a witness to the murder of Mr. Faulkner would be worth to Mrs. Faulkner?
We object, Your Honor.
Objection sustained.
I should like to remind Mr. Stevens that he can be sued for making insinuations of these kinds.
I made no insinuation. I merely asked a question in a general way.
Then I'd like to inform you in a general way that perjury is not part of a private investigator's duties.
No special notation to the rule?
None.
That is all, Mr. Van Fleet.
Not quite. I want you to ask him 2 more questions, Stevens.
Certainly, Miss Andre. What are they? What kind of a car do you drive, Mr. Van Fleet?
A brown Buick Coupe, last year's model, old but serviceable.
Did you see any car following the gentleman in the gray coat when he drove away?
I don't recall that I did. The traffic was heavy that night.
That's all, Mr. Van Fleet.
Inspector Sweeney.
Elmer Sweeney. Kindly raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Your name.
Elmer Sweeney,
Your occupation.
Inspector of Police.
On the night of January 16th, were you called upon to investigate Bjorn Faulkner's death?
Yes, sir. I was one of the first officers to reach the spot.
Did you question Miss Andre?
Oh, not right away. Oh, before I could do anything, that fella Van Fleet rushed up to me and he yelled that he had seen Karen Andre throw Faulkner off the roof.
How did Miss Andre react to this?
Oh, she was stunned. She stood wide-eyed, eyes fit to burst. And then, cross my heart, sir, she started laughing. I thought she went crazy.
What did you do?
I ordered her held for questioning. We took her up with us in the elevator to examine the penthouse. What a joint.
Did you find anything unusual?
Unusual? Yes, sir. The bedroom.
Ah, and what did you find in the bedroom?
Nightgowns, sir. Lace nightgowns. Just about made out of thin air. A crystal bathtub in the bathroom. And we turned on the shower, and the water was perfumed.
You misunderstood my question, Inspector. I wasn't referring to the aesthetic values of the penthouse. I asked you if you found anything unusual that could be connected with Bjorn Faulkner's death.
Unusual? Yes, sir. In the living room.
And what was that?
A letter. It was left in plain sight on a table. It was sealed, and the address said, "To whomever finds it first."
Is this the letter?
Yes, sir.
Will you kindly read it to the jury?
If any future historian wants to record my last advice to humanity, I'll say that I found only two enjoyable things on this earth whose every door was open to me. My whip over the world and Karen Andre. To those who can use it, the advice is worth what it has cost mankind. Bjorn Faulkner.
Submitted as evidence.
Accepted as Exhibit A.
Did you question Miss Andre about this letter?
I did. She said Mr. Faulkner had written it and left it there on the table and ordered her not to touch it. Then he went out to the roof garden. Oh, she struggled with him when she saw what he was going to do, but she couldn't stop him.
Did you ask her who had been with them that night?
I did. She said two gentlemen had. They were friends of Mr. Faulkner's, and she had never seen them before. Mr. Faulkner had picked him up that evening at a nightclub and brought them along. She said their names were Jerry White and Dick Saunders.
Did you try to find any gentlemen by these names among Mr. Faulkner's acquaintances?
We did, and we found no one had ever heard of them.
And Miss Andre told you, as she did at her inquest, that she had never seen these two men before.
Yes, sir.
Was she very emphatic about that?
Yes, sir. Very.
That is all, Inspector.
Miss Andre told you that she struggled with Mr. Faulkner to prevent his suicide. Did you notice any sign of a struggle in her clothes?
Oh, yes, sir. Her dress was torn. It had diamond shoulder straps, and one of them was broken, so she had to hold the dress up with one hand.
What did you think of that?
Do I have to answer?
I'm afraid you do.
Well, I wish he'd broken the other strap, too.
I meant, did you think her dress looked as though it had been torn in a struggle?
Yes, sir. It looked as that, yes.
Now, can you tell us why on earth you turned the shower on in the bathroom?
Well, you see, sir, we had heard that Faulkner had wine in it instead of water.
You mustn't believe all the legends about Bjorn Faulkner. That's all, Inspector.
Magda Svensson.
Magda Svensson. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I swear.
What is your name?
You know it. You just call me.
Kindly answer my question without argument. State your name.
Magda Svensson.
What is your occupation?
I am housekeeper.
By whom were you employed last?
By Herr Bjorn Faulkner, and before that, his father.
How long have you been employed by them?
I've been in the family 38 years. I remember Herr Bjorn since he was little boy.
When did you come to America?
I've been here 5 years.
What were the duties Mr. Faulkner assigned to you?
I keep penthouse for him. He visit here every year or so. I stay even after he go, when he get married. But I never employed by this one.
Now, Mrs. Svensson, what...
Miss Svensson.
I beg your pardon, Miss Svensson. What do you know about Miss Andre's relationship with Mr. Faulkner?
Decent woman like me shouldn't know about such things. But sin is shameless in this world.
Tell us about it, Miss Svensson.
From very first day this woman appeared, she was sleeping with Herr Faulkner. Tisn't a good thing when man forgets lying between his bed and his desk. And she put her claws tight on both. Sometimes they talk loans and dividends in bed. Other times the door to his office was locked. And under the window shade that was pulled down, I seen her lace pants on the windowsill.
Your Honor, we object.
I think Miss Andre should have objected many years ago.
Such line of testimony is outrageous.
Pertaining to the vital question of their relationship and...
Gentlemen, silence. I shall ask the witness to word her testimony more carefully.
Sin is sin, any name you call it, Judge.
Miss Svensson, do you know of any instance when Miss Andre's conduct was detrimental to Mr. Faulkner in ways other than moral?
I do so. You try count up all the money he wasted on that woman.
Can you tell us an instance of Mr. Faulkner's extravagance?
I tell you, he had a platinum gown made for her. Yes, I said platinum. Oh, fine mesh, fine and soft as silk. She wore it over her naked body. He would make a fire in the fireplace and heat the dress and then put it on her. It cooled, and you could see her body in silver sheen. Would have been more decent if she had been naked. And she asked to put it on hot as she could stand. And if it burned her shameless skin, she laughed like the pagan she is. And he kissed the burn, wild like tiger.
Your Honor, we object. This testimony is irrelevant and only tends to prejudice the jury against Miss Andre.
Let her talk, Stevens. Perhaps it may prejudice the jury in my favor.
Mr. Stevens has my sympathy. His client is not an easy one to handle.
Silence! Objection overruled.
Did you observe Mr. Faulkner's attitude toward his marriage?
He was happy for first time in his life. He was happy like a decent man what found right road.
Did you know of anything that made him worry in those days that could bring him to suicide eventually?
No, nothing.
Now, tell us, Miss Svensson, did you observe Miss Andre's attitude toward Mr. Faulkner's marriage?
She silent, like stone statue. She
Mrs. Faulkner!
I understand you wanted to call me as a witness, Mr. Flint?
I did, but I thought you were in California.
I was. I escaped.
You escaped?
Father was concerned over my health. He wouldn't allow me to come back, but I wanted to do my duty towards the memory of my husband. I'm at your disposal, Mr. Flint.
I can only express my deepest appreciation. Mrs. Faulkner, if you'd kindly take a seat, I'll be with you in just a moment.
Thank you.
You were telling us about Miss Andre's attitude toward Mr. Faulkner's marriage, Miss Svensson.
I said she keeps silent, but I hear her crying one night after marriage. Crying, sobbing. That the first and only time in her life.
Did she seem to suffer much?
Suffer? No, not her. One man more or less make no much difference to her. I seen her unfaithful to Herr Faulkner the night of his wedding.
Unfaithful? With whom?
I don't know the man. I seen him first time the night of Herr Faulkner's wedding.
Tell us about it.
She very strange. Oh, I gone to wedding. Oh, it was beautiful. Oh, my poor Herr Bjorn so handsome, and the young bride all white and lovely as lily. Oh, I cry like looking at my own children. But she not go to wedding.
Did Miss Andre stay at home?
She stay home. I come back early. I come in servant's door. She not hear me come. She was home, but she was not alone.
Who was with her?
He was, the man, out on the roof in the garden. It was dark, but I could see. He was holding her in his arms, and I think he want to crush her bones. He bent her back so far, I think she fall in her reflection in the pool. And he kiss her, and I think he never want to take his lips off of hers.
And then?
She step aside and say something. I not hear. She speak very soft. He not say word. He just take her hand and kiss it and hold it to his lips so long, I get tired of waiting and go back to my room.
Did you learn the name of the man?
No.
Did you see him again?
Yes. Once.
And when was that?
The night of January 16th.
Tell us about it, Miss Svensson.
She very strange that day. She called me and tell me I have the rest of the day off, and I've been suspicious.
Why did that make you suspicious?
My day off is Thursday. I not ask for second day, and I tell her I not need day off, but she said she not need me, so I go.
What time did you go?
About 4 o'clock. But I want to know secret, so I come back.
When did you come back?
About 10 at night. The house was dark, she not home. So I wait. Half-hour later, I hear them come. I seen Herr Faulkner with them, so I afraid to stay. But before I go, I seen 2 gentlemen with them. One gentleman, he drank, I not know him.
Did you know the other one?
The other one? He was tall and lanky and had light eyes. He was the man I seen kissing Miss Andre.
That's all, Miss Svensson.
Just a minute, Miss Svensson. You still have to have a little talk with me.
For what? I say all I know.
Well, you may know the answer to a few more questions. Now, you said that you had seen that stranger kissing Miss Andre?
Yes, I did.
And you said it was dark that night when you saw him for the first time?
Yes, it was dark.
And on the night of January 16th, when you were so ingeniously spying on your mistress, you said that you saw her come in with Mr. Faulkner, and you hurried to depart in order not to be caught. Am I correct?
You have a good memory.
You just had a swift glance at the 2 gentlemen with them?
Yes.
Can you tell us what the drunken gentleman looked like?
How can I? No time to notice face and too dark at door.
So it was too dark, and you were in a hurry, and yet you were able to identify a man that you had seen but once before?
Let me tell you, mister, I am under oath, as you say, and I am religious woman and respect oath. But I said it was the same man, and I say it again.
That's all, Miss Fencing.
Nancy Lee Faulkner.
Nancy Lee Faulkner. You solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
What is your name?
Nancy Lee Faulkner.
What relation were you to the late Bjorn Faulkner?
I was his wife.
I realize how painful this is for you, Mrs. Faulkner, and I appreciate your courage. But I will have to ask you many questions that will awaken sad memories.
I'm ready, Mr. Flint.
When did you first meet Bjorn Faulkner?
In August of last year,
And where did you meet him?
at a ball given by my friend Sandra Van Rensselaer in Newport.
Will you kindly tell us about it, Mrs. Faulkner?
Sandra introduced us. I remember, she said, "Here's a tough one for you, Nancy. Well, I wonder if you'll add this scalp to the well-known collection." Sandra always had a way of exaggerating my popularity. We danced together that night. We danced in the garden, under the trees, and we stopped by the edge of a pool. We were alone in the darkness, with just the faint sound of the blue Danube waltz filling the silence. Mr. Faulkner reached up to pick a rose for me, and as he tore it off, his hand brushed my bare shoulder. I don't know why, but I blushed. He noticed and apologized, smiling graciously. And then he took me back to the guests. I think we both felt a silent understanding that night, for we did not dance again with each other.
When did you see Mr. Faulkner again?
3 days later, I invited him to dine at my home in Long Island. Just an informal little dinner with Father as my chaperone. It was a real Swedish meal, and I cooked it myself.
Did you see each other often after that?
Yes, quite often. His visits became more and more frequent until the day
Until the day...
the day he proposed to me.
Please tell us about it, Mrs. Faulkner.
We went driving, Mr. Faulkner and I alone. It was a beautiful day, with a bright, cold sunshine. I was driving my car. I felt so young, so happy that I grew reckless. I'm sorry. It's a little hard for me to think of those days. I was reckless. Reckless enough to lose my way. We stopped on a strange country road. I laughed and I said, "We're lost. I've kidnapped you and I won't release you." And he said that the ransom you want is not in circulation. And then suddenly he seized my hand and looking straight at me said, "What's the use of pretending? I love you, Nancy."
I'm so sorry, Mrs. Faulkner. If you wish to be dismissed, and we can continue tomorrow.
No, I'm all right. I can go on. It was then that I first learned about the desperate state of Mr. Faulkner's fortune. He said that he wanted to tell me the truth, that he couldn't offer to marry me when he had nothing to offer me. But I loved him, so I said that money had never meant anything to me.
Did Mr. Faulkner feel hopeless about his future when your engagement was announced?
No, not at all. He said that my faith in him and my courage helped him so much. I told him that it was our duty to save his enterprises, our duty to the world he had wronged, not to ourselves. I made him realize his past mistakes, and he was ready to atone for them. We were entering a new life together, a life of unselfish devotion to the service and the welfare of others.
Did you remain in New York after your wedding?
Yes. We made our home in my Long Island residence. Mr. Faulkner gave up his New York penthouse.
Did Mr. Faulkner tell you of his relations with Miss Andre?
No, not then. But he did, 2 weeks after our wedding. He came to me and said, "Dearest, there is a woman. There was a woman, and I feel like I must tell you about her." And I said, "I know it, dear. You don't have to say a word if you'd rather not."
And what did Mr. Faulkner tell you?
He said that Karen Andre is the cause and the symbol of my darkest years, and I am going to dismiss her.
And what did you answer?
I said that I understood him, and that he was right. But, I said, we must not be cruel. Perhaps you can find another position for Miss Andre. He said that he would provide for her financially, but that he never wanted to see her again.
He therefore dismissed Miss Andre voluntarily, of his own choice.
Mr. Flint, there are two types of women in this world, and my kind is never jealous of the other.
What was Mr. Faulkner's business situation after your marriage?
I'm afraid I don't understand much about business. I know Father made a loan, a very large loan, to my husband.
Mrs. Faulkner, will you tell us whether it is possible that your husband had any reason to commit suicide?
I think it totally impossible.
Did he ever speak to you about his plans for the future?
We used to dream of the future together, even on the evening before his death. We were sitting by the fire in his study, talking about the years ahead. We knew that we wouldn't have a lot of money for long. We were planning to have a modest little home with a bright kitchen and a little flower garden. We'd be so happy there, just the two of us, until we had little ones to take care of.
And this was on the night of January 15th, the day before his death.
Yes.
What did Mr. Faulkner do the day of January 16th?
He spent it in town on business as usual. He came home late in the afternoon. He said that he had to attend a business banquet in New York that night, so he didn't have time for dinner. He left at around 6 o'clock.
What banquet was Mr. Faulkner supposed to attend?
He did not tell me, and I didn't ask. I made it a point never to interfere with his business.
Did you notice anything peculiar when he said goodbye to you that night?
No, not a thing. He kissed me and said that he would try to come home early. I stood in the doorway and watched him as he drove away. He waved to me as his car disappeared in the dusk. I stood there for a few moments, thinking about how happy we were, about what a perfect dream our love had been, like a delicate idol light. I didn't know that our love would indirectly, through jealousy, bring about his death.
Your Honor, we object. Move that that be stricken out.
The witness's last sentence may be taken out.
Thank you, Mrs. Faulkner. That is all.
Will you be able to answer a few questions now, Mrs. Faulkner?
As many as you wish, Mr. Stevens.
You said your romance was like a perfect dream, didn't you?
Yes.
A sacred troth that regenerated his soul?
Yes.
A beautiful, uplifting relationship built on mutual trust?
Yes.
Then why did you hire a detective to spy on your husband?
I didn't hire a detective to spy on my husband. I hired him to protect Mr. Faulkner.
You kindly explain that?
Well, you see, some time ago, Mr. Faulkner was threatened by a gangster. Guts Regan, I believe they call him that. Mr. Faulkner didn't pay any attention to it. No one could intimidate him. And he refused to hire a bodyguard. But I was worried. So as soon as we were married, I hired Mr. Van Fleet to watch over Mr. Faulkner. I did so secretly because I knew he would object.
How could a sleuth following at a distance protect Mr. Faulkner?
Well, I heard that the underworld had a way of finding out these things, and I thought they wouldn't attack a man who was constantly being watched.
So all Mr. Van Fleet had to do was to watch Mr. Faulkner?
Yes.
Mr. Faulkner alone?
Yes.
Not Mr. Faulkner and Miss Andre?
Mr. Stevens, that supposition is insulting to me.
I haven't noticed you sparing any insults, Mrs. Faulkner.
I'm sorry, Mr. Stevens. I assure you that was not my intention.
Now, you said that Mr. Faulkner told you he never wanted to see Miss Andre again.
Yes, he did.
And yet, he continued to call on her after his marriage. He called on her often and at night. Your detective told you that, didn't he?
Yes, I knew it.
How do you explain it?
I cannot explain it. How do I know what kind of blackmail she was holding over his head?
How do you explain that on the night of January 16th, Mr. Faulkner lied to you about going to a business banquet and went to Miss Andre's house directly?
If I could explain that, Mr. Stevens, I might be able to save you the bother of this trial. We would have an explanation for my husband's mysterious death. All I know is that she made him come to her house for some reason which he could not tell me. And he was found dead that night.
Mrs. Faulkner, I'd like you to answer one more question.
Yes?
Mrs. Faulkner, I would like you to state here, under oath, that Bjorn Faulkner loved you.
Bjorn Faulkner was mine.
That is all, Mrs. Faulkner.
No, that's not all. I want you to ask her one more question, Stevens.
Certainly, Miss Andre.
Ask her whether she loved him.
I did, Miss Andre.
Then how can you speak of him as you did? How can you sit there and lie about him when he can't come back to defend himself?
I won't stand for it. Why should I be questioned by the murderers of my husband?
That's all.
I'm so sorry, Mrs. Faulkner.
The court will adjourn till 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
One of us is lying, and both of us know which one.
Court attention! Superior Court Number 11 of the State of New York, Honorable Judge William Heath presiding.
The people of the state of New York versus Karen Andre.
Ready, Your Honor.
Ready, Your Honor.
The district attorney may now proceed.
John Graham Whitfield. Kindly raise your right hand. You solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
What is your name?
John Graham Whitfield.
What is your occupation?
I'm the president of the Whitfield National Bank.
Were you related to the late Bjorn Faulkner?
I was his father-in-law.
It is obvious, Mr. Whitfield, that you are well qualified to pass judgment on financial matters. Can you tell us about the state of Mr. Faulkner's business at the time preceding his death?
I shall say it was desperate, but not hopeless. My bank had loaned Mr. Faulkner $25 million to save his enterprises. Needless to say, that money is lost.
What prompted you to make that loan, Mr. Whitfield?
He was the husband of my only daughter. Her happiness has always been paramount to me. But my motives were not entirely personal. Realizing the countless tragedies of the small investors that the crash would bring, I considered it my utmost duty to do everything I could to prevent it.
Is it possible that you have risked such a considerable sum in Mr. Faulkner's enterprises if you believe them hopelessly destined to crash?
Certainly not. It was a difficult undertaking, but I had the utmost confidence that my business acumen would have prevented the crash had Faulkner lived.
He therefore had no reason to commit suicide as far as business affairs were concerned.
He had every reason to remain alive.
Now, Mr. Whitfield, can you tell us whether Mr. Faulkner was happy in his family life, in his relations with your daughter?
Mr. Flint, I would like to state that I have always considered the home and family as the utmost institutions of our lives. You will therefore believe me when I tell you how important my daughter's family happiness was to me. She'd found perfect happiness with Mr. Faulkner.
Mr. Whitfield, what is your opinion of Mr. Faulkner?
I feel it only fair to admit that he had many qualities which I did not approve. We were as different as two people could be. I believed in one's duty above all. And Bjorn Faulkner believed in nothing but his own pleasure.
From your knowledge of him, Mr. Whitfield, would you say that you consider it possible that Mr. Faulkner committed suicide?
I consider it absolutely impossible.
Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. That is all.
Mr. Whitfield, were you very fond of your son-in-law?
Yes.
And you never disagreed with him? You never lost your temper in a quarrel?
Mr. Stevens, I never lose my temper.
If my memory serves me right, there was some kind of trouble at the time you made that stupendous loan to Mr. Faulkner. Wasn't there something said to the effect that you denied making that loan?
Purely a misunderstanding, I assure you. I must admit that Mr. Faulkner made a somewhat unethical attempt to hasten the loan, which was quite unnecessary, because I granted it gladly, for my daughter's sake.
You said your fortune has been badly damaged by the Faulkner crash?
Yes.
And your financial situation is rather strained at present?
Yes.
Then how could you afford to offer a $50,000 reward for the arrest and conviction of Gus Regan?
Objection! What has that got to do with the case?
Your Honor, if I may, I would like the privilege of explaining this.
Very well.
I did offer such a reward. It came from a feeling of civic duty. The gentleman referred to as Gus Regan is a notorious criminal. I offered the reward for evidence that would lead to his arrest and conviction. Although I agree with Mr. Flint that this has nothing to do with the present case.
Mr. Whitfield, can you tell us why you left for California in such a hurry before the beginning of this trial?
Well, I think it should be rather obvious. My daughter was completely shocked by the sudden tragedy. I took her away to save her health, perhaps her life.
You love your daughter profoundly?
I do.
You've always made it a point that her every wish should be granted?
I can proudly say yes.
And when she or you desire anything, you don't stop at the price, do you?
We don't have to.
Then would you refuse to buy her the man that she wanted?
Your Honor, we have... Mr. Stevens!
You wouldn't stop if it took your entire fortune to break the first unbreakable man you'd ever met?
Your Honor, we object.
Sustained.
Mr. Whitfield, are you telling us that your money had nothing to do with Mr. Faulkner dismissing Miss Andre? That no ultimatum was delivered to him?
You are quite mistaken in your insinuations. My daughter is no more jealous of Miss Andre than she would be of Mr. Faulkner's soiled underwear. All men have some at one time or another.
I'd be careful of statements such as this, Mr. Whitfield. Remember, your daughter paid for what Miss Andre got free.
Your Honor, why, you goddamn impudent. Do you know who I am? I could crush you like a cockroach, as I've crushed
Just
many
what
of...
I wanted to prove. That's all. Thank you, Mr. Whitfield.
Your Honor, we move that the defense counsel's outrageous remark which led to this incident be stricken out.
The remark may go out.
The people rest.
Move that the case be dismissed for lack of evidence.
Denied.
Exception. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we cannot pass judgment on Karen Andre without passing it on Bjorn Faulkner. He had put himself beyond all present standards. Whether it was above or below them is a question for each of us to decide personally. But I'll ask you to remember that he was the man who said he needed no justification for his actions. He was the justification. He was the man who said that laws were made for the fun of breaking. If you'll remember this, you'll understand that the life into which he was thrown in the last few months of his life was as impossible to him as that of a tiger in a vegetarian cafeteria. And to escape it, he would be driven to the most desperate means, including suicide. Our first witness will be Jane Chandler.
Jane Chandler. Kindly raise your right hand. You solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Your name?
Jane Chandler,
Your occupation?
handwriting expert of the New York Police Department.
Do you recognize this letter?
Yes, it was the letter found in Mr. Faulkner's penthouse on the night of his death. I've been called upon to examine it.
What were you asked to determine?
I was asked to determine if the letter was written by Mr. Faulkner.
What is your verdict?
Yes, this letter was written by Bjorn Faulkner.
Your witness?
Miss Chandler, it has been called to your attention during the inquest that Miss Andre was in the habit of signing Faulkner's name to unimportant documents at the time she was employed as his secretary. Have you compared those signatures with Faulkner's real ones?
I have.
What is your opinion of them?
I can compliment Miss Andre on her art. The difference is very slight.
With Miss Andre's knowledge of Mr. Faulkner, is it possible that she could have forged this letter so perfectly as to escape detection?
It is not probable, but it is possible.
That is all.
Sigurd Ljungqvist.
Sigurd Ljungqvist. Kindly raise your right hand. You solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
What is your name?
Sigurd Ljungqvist.
What is your occupation?
My last job was secretary to Herr Bjorn Faulkner.
How long did you hold that position?
Since beginning of November, since Miss Andre left.
What was your job before that?
Bookkeeper to Bjorn Faulkner.
How long did you hold that position?
8 years.
Did Mr. Faulkner give you Miss Andre's position when she was dismissed?
Yes.
Did Miss Andre instruct you in your new duties?
Yes, she did.
What was her behavior at that time? Did she seem to be angry, sorry, or resentful?
No, she was very calm, like always, and explained everything clearly.
Did you notice any trouble between Miss Andre and Mr. Faulkner?
Herr Lawyer, there can be no more trouble between Herr Faulkner and Miss Andre as between you and your face in the mirror.
Have you ever witnessed any business conferences between Mr. Faulkner and Mr. Whitfield?
I never been present at conferences, but I seen Herr Whitfield come to our office many times. Herr Whitfield, he not like Herr Faulkner.
What makes you think that?
I heard what he said one day. Herr Faulkner was desperate for money, and Herr Whitfield asked him, sarcastic like, what he would do if his business were to crash. Herr Faulkner shrugged and said lightly, "Oh, commit suicide." Herr Whitfield looked at him very strangely and coldly and said very slowly, "If you do, be sure you make a good job of it."
If Your Honor, please, I'd like to report this incident, which I consider as a hoax and whose purpose I would like to determine. A man has just called on the telephone insisting to talk to me immediately, and when informed this was impossible, he gave the following message just brought to me. Do not put Karen Andre on the stand until I get there. No signature.
I want to go on the stand right away.
May I ask why, Miss Andre?
Question me now, Stevens.
I'm afraid that's impossible, Miss Andre. We have to finish the examination of Mr. Youngquist.
Then hurry! Hurry!
I shall ask the defendant to refrain from further interruption.
Where were you on the night of January 16th?
I was at our office in the Faulkner building. I was working. I've been working late for many nights.
What did you do when you heard about Mr. Faulkner's death?
I went to call Herr Whitfield. I telephoned his home in Long Island, but butler say he not there. I called his office in the city, but no answer. No one there. Called many places, but not find Herr Whitfield. Then I called Whitfield home again, and I have to tell Mrs. Faulkner that Herr Faulkner committed suicide.
And when you told her that, what were Mrs. Faulkner's first words?
She said, "For God's sake, don't give it to the newspapers."
That is all.
Just one moment, please, Miss Andre. Why such a hurry? Whom are you expecting? Mr. Youngquist, you have been employed by Bjorn Faulkner for over 8 years, haven't you?
Yes.
Did you know all that time how crooked and criminal your boss's operations were?
No, I did not know that.
Did you know now that he was a criminal and a swindler?
No.
You don't, eh? And you didn't know what all those brilliant financial operations were, did you?
I know Herr Faulkner did what others not allowed to do, but I never wonder and I never doubt. I know it was not wrong.
And how did you know that?
Because he was Herr Bjorn Faulkner.
And he could do no wrong.
Herr Lawyer, when little people like you and me meet a man like Bjorn Faulkner, we take off our hats and we bow, and sometimes we take orders, but we don't ask questions.
Splendid, my dear Mr. Youngquist. Your devotion to your master is worthy of admiration. You would do anything for him, wouldn't you?
Yes.
Are you very dedicated to Miss Andre, too?
Miss Andre was dear to Herr Faulkner.
Then such a little matter as a few lies for your master's sake would mean nothing to you.
I not lied, Herr Lawyer. Herr Faulkner is dead and cannot tell me to lie. But if I had choice, I lie for Herr Faulkner rather than tell truth for you.
For which statement I am more grateful than you can guess, Herr Youngquist. That is all.
What is your name?
Karen Andre,
What was your last position?
secretary to Bjorn Faulkner.
How long have you held that position?
10 years.
Tell us about your first meeting with Bjorn Faulkner.
I answered his advertisement for a stenographer. I saw him for the first time at his office on an obscure side street in Stockholm. He was alone. It was my first job in his first office.
How did Mr. Faulkner meet you?
He got up and didn't say a word, just stood and looked at me. His mouth was insulting even when silent. Couldn't stand his gaze for very long. I didn't know whether I wanted to kneel or slap his face. I didn't do either. Told him what I'd come for.
Did he hire you then?
Said I was too young and he didn't like me, but he threw a stenographer's pad at me and told me to get down to work before he was in a hurry. So I did.
And you worked all day?
All day. He dictated as fast, almost faster than he could talk. He didn't give me time to say a word. He never smiled once. He never took his eyes off me.
When did he first
Take me? That first day I met him.
How did that happen?
He seemed to take a delight in giving me orders. He acted as if he was cracking a whip over an animal he wanted to break. And I was afraid.
Because you didn't like that?
Because I liked it. So when I finished my 8 hours, I told him I was quitting. He looked at me and didn't say a word, but he asked me suddenly that I'd ever belonged to a man. I said, no, I hadn't. He told me he'd give me 1,000 kroners to go in the inner office and take my skirt off. I told him I wouldn't. He said if I didn't, he would take me. And I said, try it. He did. After a while, I picked up my clothes, but I didn't go. I stayed, kept the job.
And you worked and lived and rose to success together ever since?
10 years. When we made our first 1,000,000 kroner, he took me to Vienna. We sat at a restaurant where the orchestra was playing Sing Gypsy. When we made 10 million, he took me to Delhi. And we stood on the shores of the Ganges, on the steps of an old temple where human slaves were sacrificed to the gods. When we made 25 million, took me to New York, and we hired a pilot to fly above the city. And the wind waved Bjorn's hair like a banner of the world at his feet.
Can you tell us the extent of Mr. Faulkner's personal fortune at the height of his success?
No, he couldn't tell you himself. He had no personal fortune. He took what he wanted. When he owed money to one of his companies, it was crossed off the books and debited to the accounts of several other affairs. It was very simple. We prepared the balance sheets ourselves.
Why would a man of Mr. Faulkner's genius resort to such methods?
Because he wanted to build a gigantic net and to build it fast. A net over the world held in his own hand. He had to draw unlimited sums of money. He had to establish his credit, so he paid out dividends from his capital. Dividends much higher than we actually earned.
When did Mr. Faulkner's business difficulties start?
Over a year ago.
What brought him to America this time?
Short-term loan of $10 million from the Whitfield National Bank was due, and we could not make it. We needed an extension. Whitfield refused it. Until his daughter came into the question.
Well, how did that happen?
Bjorn had met her at a party. She made it obvious that she was greatly interested in him. One day he came to me and said, Karen, we only have one piece of collateral left and you're holding it. You'll have to let me borrow it for a while. I said, certainly, what is it? said it was himself. I asked, Nancy Whitfield? And he nodded. Didn't answer at first. It wasn't easy to say. Then I said, all right, Bjorn. And he asked, will this change things between us? And I said, no.
Had Mr. Faulkner proposed to Miss Whitfield?
No. She proposed to him. He told me about it. She took him for a drive and they stopped on a lonely road. Then she said that they were lost, that she had kidnapped him and she wouldn't release him. He answered that the ransom she wanted was not in circulation, and then she turned to him and point blank and said, I want you, and you know it, and what's the use of pretending? You don't want me, and I know that, but I pay for what I want. And I have the price. He asked, and what is the price? And she answered, extension on a $10 million loan that you need to save your company. If you want to stay out of jail as a swindler, it can only be in the custody of Mrs. Bjorn Faulkner.
What was Mr. Faulkner's answer to that, Miss Andre?
He said it cost you an awful lot of money. And she answered, money never meant anything to me. Then he said, will you always remember that it's a business deal? That you are not buying any feeling and you're not to expect any. Then she replied, I don't need any. You'll have your money and I'll have you. Such was the bargain.
Was Mr. Whitfield eager to accept that bargain?
Bjorn thought that Mr. Whitfield would have a stroke when his daughter's decision was announced to him. But Miss Whitfield insisted. She always had her way. It was agreed that the loan would be extended and that Whitfield would give Bjorn unlimited credit.
In other words, Mr. Faulkner sold himself as his last security?
Yes. But like the others, it meant nothing to him.
Did you resent that marriage?
No, I didn't. We always faced our business as a war. We looked at this as our hardest campaign.
Why did Mr. Faulkner dismiss you 2 weeks after the wedding?
Bjorn was forced to do that. Mr. Whitfield refused to advance the money he had promised.
What reason did Whitfield give for that refusal?
The reason being that Bjorn had a mistress. That was Miss Whitfield's ultimatum. I had to be dismissed.
And did Mr. Whitfield grant the loan after you were dismissed?
No, he didn't. He refused it again. He attached what they call a slight condition to it.
And what was that condition?
He wanted the controlling interest in Bjorn's enterprises.
Did Mr. Faulkner agree to that?
Bjorn said he would rather gather all his stock certificates in one pile and strike a match.
Then did Mr. Whitfield grant the loan?
No, he didn't grant it. Bjorn took it.
How did he do that?
By forging Whitfield's signature on $25 million worth of securities.
How do you know that?
I helped him to do it.
Did this help Mr. Faulkner?
Only temporarily. Certain dividend payments were coming due and we could not meet them. Bjorn had stretched his credit to the utmost and there was no more to be had.
How did Mr. Faulkner take this situation?
He knew it was the end.
What was his plan?
You don't find men like Bjorn Faulkner cringing before a bankruptcy commission, and you don't find them locked in jail.
And the alternative?
Bjorn was not afraid of the world. He had defied its every law. He was going to leave when and how you please. pleased. He was.
I told you to wait for me!
Larry, keep quiet, please. Oh, please keep quiet, Larry. You promised you'd stay away.
Karen, you don't understand. You don't.
Your Honor, I demand that you do not allow this man to testify.
Why not, Miss Andre?
Your Honor.
Stop her. Stop her, for God's sake. Stop her.
Your Honor, this man loves me. He'll do anything to save me. He'll lie. Don't believe a word he says.
Karen, your sacrifice is useless. Bjorn Faulkner's dead.
He's dead?
Yes.
You're dead?
Court attention! Superior Court number 11 of the State of New York, Honorable Judge William Heath presiding.
People of the State of New York versus Karen Andre.
Ready, Your Honor.
Miss Andre, when you took the stand yesterday, did you know the whole truth of this case?
No.
Do you wish to retract any of your testimony?
No.
When you first took the stand, did you intend to shield anyone?
Yes.
Whom?
Bjorn Faulkner.
Do you still find it necessary to shield Mr. Faulkner?
No. It's not necessary anymore.
Do you still claim that Bjorn Faulkner committed suicide?
No. Bjorn Faulkner did not commit suicide. He was murdered. And I did not kill him. Please believe me. Not for my sake, but I don't care what you do to me now, but because you cannot allow his murder to remain unpunished. I'll tell you the whole truth. I lied at the inquest. I lied to my own attorney. I was going to lie here, but everything I have told you so far is true. I'll tell you the rest.
You had started telling us about Mr. Faulkner's way out of his difficulties.
I told you that he was going to leave this world, but he was not to kill himself. I did throw a man off the penthouse, but that body was dead before I threw it. It was not Bjorn Faulkner.
Will you please explain this, Miss Andre?
Bjorn wanted to be officially dead. No searches or investigations were to bother him. He was to disappear. That suicide was staged. He had had the plan in mind for a long time. He had kept $10 million of the Whitfield forgery for this. We needed someone to help us. Someone who could not be connected to Bjorn in any way. There was only one such person. Regan.
What made you believe that Mr. Regan would be willing to help in so dangerous an undertaking?
He loved me.
And he agreed to help you in spite of that?
He agreed because of that.
What was the plan?
Regan was to get a corpse, but he wasn't to kill anyone for the purpose. We waited, and on the night of January 16th, Lefty O'Toole, a gunman, was killed by rival gangsters. His murderers have since been arrested and have confessed, so you can be sure that Regan had nothing to do with the murder. But you may remember reading in the papers that O'Toole's body disappeared mysteriously from his mother's house. That was Regan's work. O'Toole's height, measurements, and hair were the same as Bjorn's. He was the man I threw off the penthouse.
Was that the extent of Mr. Regan's help?
No. Regan was to get an airplane and take Bjorn to South America. Bjorn never learned to operate a plane. Regan used to be a transport pilot. And that day, January 16th, Bjorn transferred $10 million to 3 banks in Buenos Aires under the name of Ragnar Hedin. A month later, I was to meet him at the Hotel Continental in Buenos Aires. Until then, the 3 of us were not to communicate with each other. No matter what happened, we were not to reveal the secret.
Tell us what happened on the night of January 16th.
Bjorn came to my house that night. I'll never forget his smile when he stepped off the elevator. He loved danger. We had dinner together. At 9:30, we went to Regan's. He had O'Toole's body dressed in traveling clothes. We drove back to my house. Bjorn wanted to be seen entering the building, so I didn't use my key. I rang the doorbell. And we were dressed formally to make it look like a gay party. Bjorn and Regan supported the body as if it were a drunken friend. And the night watchman opened the door. Then we went up into the elevator.
And then what happened?
Bjorn exchanged clothes with the corpse. He wrote the letter. Then they carried out the body and left it leaning against the parapet. And so we said goodbye. Bjorn was to go first. He was to go down in the elevator. Watch the needle of that indicator go down. 50 floors down. It stopped. He was gone.
And then?
No. Regan followed him a few minutes later. They were to meet 10 miles out of the city where Regan had left the airplane. I stayed alone for an hour. The house was so silent. I didn't want to wait in the garden with the corpse, the man that was supposed to be Bjorn. I laid in my bed in my bedroom. I got Bjorn's robe and I buried my face in it. I could almost feel the warmth of his body. There was a clock sitting next to the bed and it ticked in the darkness. I waited. When an hour passed, I knew the airplane had taken off. I got up, tore my dress to make it look like a struggle. Then I went out to the garden, the parapet. I looked down. So many lights, and the world seemed so small, so far away. Then I threw the body over. And I watched it fall. I thought all of Bjorn's troubles went with it. I didn't know that his life went too.
That is all, Miss Andre.
I must confess, Miss Andre, that there's not much left for me to do. You've done all my work yourself. Now tell us, didn't Mr. Faulkner have a clear conception of the difference between right and wrong?
Bjorn never thought of things as right or wrong. To him, it was only you can or you can't. He always could.
And yourself? Didn't you object to helping him in all those crimes?
To me, it was only he wants or he doesn't.
You said that Bjorn Faulkner loved you.
Yes.
Did he ever ask you to marry him?
No. What for?
Don't you know that there are laws made for situations such as these?
Laws made by whom, Mr. Flint? And for whom?
Miss Andre, did your attorney warn you that anything you say here may be held against you?
I came here to tell the truth.
You love Bjorn Faulkner.
Yes.
Such as he was.
Because he was such as he was.
Exactly, Miss Andre. Now, what would you do if a woman were to take away from you the man you worship so insanely? If she appealed to his soul and not his animal desires, as you seem to have done so successfully? If she changed the ruthless scoundrel you loved into her own ideal of an upright man, would you still love him?
Your Honor, we object. Objection sustained.
But I want to answer. I want the district attorney to know that he is insulting Bjorn Faulkner's memory.
You do. But you thought nothing of insulting him while he lived. By an affair with a gangster.
You damn!
Don't, Larry. You're mistaken, Mr. Flint. Regan loved me. I didn't love him.
And he didn't demand the usual price for his help?
He demanded nothing.
You were the only one who knew of all the details of Faulkner's criminal activities.
Yes.
You had enough information to send him to jail at any time.
I'd never do that.
But you could, if you wanted to.
I suppose so.
Well, Miss Andre, isn't that the explanation of Faulkner's visits to you after his marriage? He had reformed. He wanted to avoid a crash. But you held it over his head. You could ruin his plans and expose him before he had made good for his crimes. But wasn't it fear, not love, that held him in your hands?
Bjorn never knew the meaning of the word fear.
Miss Andre, who knew about the transfer of $10 million to Buenos Aires?
Only Bjorn, myself, and Regan.
Regan. Now, Faulkner could have had a perfectly legitimate business reason for that transfer.
I don't know of any.
You mean you won't tell of any? Now, Miss Andre, Bjorn Faulkner kept you in extravagant luxury for 10 years. You enjoyed platinum gowns and other little things like that. You hated to change your mode of living. You hated to see him turn his fortune over to investors, to see him poor, didn't you?
I was never to see him poor.
No, of course not. Because you and your gangster lover were to murder him and get the $10 million no one knew about.
Your Honor, we object. Sustained.
You've heard it testified that Faulkner had no reason to commit suicide. He had no more reason to escape from the first happiness he'd ever known. And you hated him for that happiness, didn't you?
You don't understand Bjorn Faulkner.
Maybe I don't. But let's see if I understand you correctly. You were raped by a man the first day you saw him. You lived with him for 10 years in a brazenly illicit relationship. You defrauded thousands of investors the world over. You cultivated a friendship with a notorious gangster. You helped in a $25 million forgery. You told us all of this proudly, flaunting your defiance of all decency. And you don't expect us to believe you capable of murder.
You're wrong, Mr. Flint. I am capable of murder. For Bjorn Faulkner's sake.
That is all, Miss Andre.
Lawrence Regan.
Lawrence Regan. Kindly raise your right hand. You solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
What is your name?
Lawrence Regan.
What is your occupation?
Unemployed.
How long have you known Karen Andre?
About 5 months.
Where did you meet her?
I met her in Faulkner's office. I went there to do a little business with him, and I gave up on the business because I met the secretary.
How did you happen to become friendly with Miss Andre?
Wasn't exactly friendly at first. She wouldn't let me in to see Faulkner. She said I had enough money to buy orchids by the pound and that I had no business with her boss. So I told her I'd think it over, and I went and I thought it over, only I didn't think of the business. I thought of her. So the next day I sent her a pound of orchids. You ever see how many that makes? Well, that's how it started.
Were you aware of Miss Andre's relations with Mr. Faulkner?
I knew it before I ever saw her. What of it? Listen, I knew it was hopeless, but I couldn't help it.
You never expected her to share that feeling?
No.
You never made any attempt to force it upon her?
You have to know all that?
I'm afraid we do.
I kissed her once, by force. It was the night of Faulkner's wedding. She was alone, and she was so unhappy. And I was so crazy about her. Well, she said it was no use, and I didn't want her to know, but she knew. And then we just never mentioned it again.
What did Miss Andre tell you of Faulkner's planned escape?
About 2 weeks before we pulled it.
Was Lefty O'Toole one of your men?
No.
Were you connected with his murderers in any way?
No.
You actually had no definite knowledge of the planned murder?
No, I just, I had a way of guessing.
What happened on the night of January 16th?
Well, it's exactly as Miss Andre has told you, only she only knows half the story because I know the rest.
Tell us what happened after you left the penthouse.
I left about 10 minutes after Faulkner. He had taken my car, and I had one of my men leave another car by the door, and I stepped on it, full speed.
Where did you go?
Meadows Lane. It's about 10 miles out in Kings County. I left my plane there earlier in the evening, and Faulkner was supposed to get there first and then wait for me.
What time did you get there?
It was around midnight. Yeah, it was a bright moon. I turned off the road, and I saw tire tracks in the mud where Faulkner's car had passed. Then I drove up on the lane, and I thought I was losing my mind because the plane was gone.
What did you do?
I searched around the lane for 2 hours. Faulkner's car was where we had agreed to hide it. The car was empty, the lights were off, keys were in the switch. And then I looked down the ground, I saw tracks where the airplane had taken off, but there's no way Faulkner could have flown it himself.
Did you search for any clues to this mystery?
Yeah, I searched like a bloodhound.
Did you find anything?
I did. One thing, a car.
What kind of a car?
Well, it was hidden deep in the bushes on the other side of the lane. It was a big black sedan.
What did you do?
Well, I wanted to know whose car it was, so smashed a window, I crawled in the back seat, and I settled in for the wait.
How long did you have to wait?
The rest of the night.
And then what happened?
Then the owner came back. I saw him coming. His face looked queer. He had no hat, and his clothes were wrinkled and grease-spotted.
What did you do?
Well, I pretended to be asleep in the back seat. I watched him. He approached, he opened the door, then he saw me, and he gave such a yell and a start like he'd been struck in the heart. Yeah, his nerves were jittery.
And then what happened?
Well, then I awakened with a start, stretched, rubbed my eyes. And I said, "Oh, it's you. Fancy such a meeting." Well, he didn't like that much. He said, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" I said, "My name's Guts Regan. You may have heard of it. I was in a little trouble and needed a place to hide. Well, your car proved to be quite a convenience. He said, well, that's too bad. I'm going to have to ask you to get out. I'm in a hurry.
Did you get out?
No. I stretched and said, what's the hurry? He said, it's none of your business. Well, I smiled and I said, it's not for me. It's just that there's a certain columnist who's a friend of mine who I'm sure would appreciate the story of a gentleman of your prominence wandering around the wilderness during milkman time. In fact, I'm sure he'd like to know the whole story.
What did the man say?
Nothing. He took out his checkbook, looked at me. I shrugged. I looked at him. He said, would $5,000 be a suitable token of my appreciation to keep your mouth shut? I said, it'll do. Lawrence Regan's the name. And he wrote out the check. And here it is.
I offer the check in evidence.
What's all this nonsense? Who was the man?
Who was the man, Mr. Regan?
Let the clerk read the check to you.
Kindly read the check.
Dated January 17th. Pay to the order of Lawrence Regan the sum of $5,000. Signed, John Graham Whitfield.
It's an outrage!
I demand to see that check.
Silence! If there are any more demonstrations of this kind, I shall order the courtroom cleared.
We offer this check in evidence.
Objection.
Objection overruled. Admitted in evidence.
What did you do after you received the check, Mr. Regan?
Well, I put it in my pocket. I thanked him. Then I drew my gun and I asked him, listen, you lousy bastard, what'd you do with Faulkner? Well, he opened his mouth like a fish choking. Couldn't make a sound.
Your Honor, is this man to be allowed to make such statements in public, in my presence?
The witness is allowed to testify. If it's proved to be perjury, he will suffer the consequences. Proceed, Mr. Stevens.
What did he answer?
Well, at first he muttered, I don't know what you're talking about. But I jammed that gun harder and I said, cut it out. I got no time to waste. I'm in it, and so are you. Where'd you take him? Well, he said, if you kill me, you'll never find out.
Did you get any information out of him?
Not a word. I didn't want to kill him, yet. He said, if you expose me, you'll expose the fake suicide and Faulkner will be found. Well, I asked, is he alive? He said, go ask him. Well, I talked, I threatened, it didn't matter. Finally, I let him go. I knew where I could always get him.
Did you try to find Faulkner?
I didn't waste a second. I drove home, changed clothes, grabbed a sandwich and an airplane, and I flew to Buenos Aires. I searched, I advertised in the papers, no one answered. No one had called into the banks for Radnor Heaton's millions.
Did you try to communicate about this with Miss Andre?
No, we had promised to stay away from each other for a month. Besides, she had been arrested for Faulkner's murder, though I laughed when I read that. But I couldn't say a word, not to betray Faulkner if he was still alive, so I just waited.
What were you waiting for?
February the 16th, Hotel Continental, Buenos Aires. I set my teeth and I waited every second of every minute of every hour of that day. But he didn't come.
And then?
Well, then I knew he was dead. I flew back to New York, I started the search for my plane, and we found it yesterday.
Where did you find it?
In a deserted valley in New Jersey, about 100 miles out from Meadows Lane. I recognized it by the engine number. It had been landed and set on fire.
Was the plane empty?
No, there was a body of a man in it.
Could you identify him?
No one could. It was nothing but a burnt skeleton. But it was the same height. I knew it was Faulkner. I examined the body, or what was left of it. I found 2 bullet holes, one in his right hand, one in the rib right over his heart. Yeah, he didn't die without putting up a fight. He must have been disarmed, shot through the hand, and then murdered, defenseless, straight through the heart.
That's all, Mr. Regan.
Just what is your business, Mr. Regan?
You'd like me to answer that, wouldn't you?
We object, Your Honor. The witness has a right not to answer that question.
Sustained.
Mr. Regan, what do you do when prospective clients refuse to pay your protection?
You know I'm legally allowed not to understand what you're talking about.
Very well. You don't have to understand. May I question you as to whether you read newspapers?
Well, you may.
Well?
Question me.
Will you kindly state whether you read newspapers?
Occasionally.
Then did you happen to read that when a Mr. James Sutton Vance Jr. refused to pay a certain gangster's protection, his magnificent country home in Westchester was destroyed by an explosion just after his guests left, just barely missing a wholesale slaughter? What would you call that? A coincidence?
I call that a remarkable coincidence, Mr. Flint. And just after the guests left.
And did you read that when a Mr. Van Dorn...
We object, Your Honor. Such questions are irrelevant.
Sustained.
So you had no ill feelings toward Mr. Faulkner for the failure of your business with him?
No.
Now, Mr. Guts, I beg your pardon, Mr. Lawrence Regan, what would you do if someone were to take the woman you loved and raped her?
Cut his throat with a dull saw.
You would. And you expect us to believe that you, Guts Regan, gangster, outlaw, scum of the underworld, would step aside with a grand gesture and throw the woman you wanted into another man's arms?
I loved her.
You did? Why did you allow Faulkner to visit her after his marriage?
I had no say in that.
No? You didn't hold a blackmail plot over his head?
You got any proof of that?
Your association with you is my best proof.
Objection.
Sustained.
How did you kill Faulkner in the penthouse that night?
Objection.
Sustained.
Where is your other accomplice, the man that played the drunk?
I can give you his exact address. That'd be Evergreen Cemetery, Whitfield Family Memorial. Probably the swankiest place old Lefty's ever been.
Now let me get this clear. You claim that the man buried in Evergreen Cemetery is Lefty O'Toole, and the man you found in the burned plane is Bjorn Faulkner?
Yes.
And what's the proof that it isn't the other way around? Supposing you did steal O'Toole's body, what's to prove that you didn't stage the fantastic thing yourself? That you didn't plant the airplane and the body in New Jersey and then appear with that wild story in a desperate attempt to save your mistress? You've heard her tell us that you'd do anything for her, that you would lie for her.
We object, Your Honor.
Objection sustained.
Where's your real proof, Mr. Regan?
Mr. Flint, you're a district attorney, and you know what I am. We both have a lot of dirty business to do. Such is life, at least most of it. But do you really think that we're both so low that if something happens to which one kneels, that we no longer have eyes to see it? I loved her. She loved Faulkner. And that's our only proof.
That's all, Mr. Regan.
John Graham Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, where were you on the night of January 16th?
I believe I was in New York City that evening on business.
Do you have anyone who can prove it?
Mr. Stevens, you must realize I'm not in the habit of providing myself alibis. I've never had to keep track of my activities or secure any witnesses. I wouldn't be able to find them now.
How many cars do you own, Mr. Whitfield?
4.
What are they?
One is a black sedan, which you are evidently anxious to learn. I may remind you that it's not the only black sedan in New York City.
You have recently returned from California by plane?
Yes.
Did you fly it yourself?
Yes,
You're a licensed pilot then?
I am.
That story of Mr. Regan's is nothing but a lie, isn't it?
It is.
Then who wrote the $5,000 check?
I did.
Will you kindly explain it?
It's very simple. We all know Mr. Regan's profession. He threatened to kidnap my daughter. I preferred to pay him off than take any chances on her life.
The check is dated January 17th. On that same day, you announced your offer of a reward for the arrest of Gus Regan, didn't you?
Yes. Besides my civic duty, I was concerned about my daughter's safety and wanted prompt action.
Mr. Whitfield, your daughter and your fortune are your most cherished possessions, aren't they?
They are.
What would you do to a man who took your money and deserted your daughter for another woman?
Your Honor, we object.
Sustained.
You hated Faulkner. You wanted to break him. You suspected his intention of faking his suicide. The words that Ljungqvist heard you say prove it, didn't you?
I suspected nothing of the kind.
And on January 16th, didn't you spend the day watching Faulkner?
Certainly not.
Weren't you trailing him in your black sedan? And didn't you follow him as soon as he left the penthouse that night?
Fantastic. How would I have recognized him, assuming it were Faulkner leaving? Van Fleet, the detective, didn't.
Van Fleet wasn't looking for a trick. He had no suspicion of the plot. You had.
My dear Mr. Stevens, how could I have known about the plot for that night?
You had no particular information about Faulkner's activities at that time?
None.
You heard of nothing unusual that day?
Not a thing.
For instance, you did not hear that he transferred $10 million to Buenos Aires?
I never heard of it.
Ah! I killed him! I killed Bjorn Faulkner! God help me! I helped that man to kill him! The whole truth, so help me God! I did not know, but I see it now. He killed Faulkner because he lied. He knew about the $10 million. I told him!
Now, look here, my man.
That's all, Mr. Whitfield.
No questions.
Kindly take the stand, Mr. Ljungqvist. Mr. Ljungqvist, you told Whitfield about the transfer?
He asked me many times about the 10 million, where it was spent. I did not know it was a secret. That day, I told him about Buenos Aires. That day, at noon, January 16th.
You told Whitfield?
I did. God have pity on me. I did not know. I would give my life for Herr Faulkner. And I helped to kill him!
That is all.
Were you alone with Mr. Whitfield when you told him?
Yes?
Then it is your word against Mr. Whitfield's.
Yes?
That's all.
Any other witnesses?
No, Your Honor.
The defense may now proceed with closing arguments.
Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you are here to decide the fate of a woman. But much more than one woman is here on trial. Before you pronounce your verdict on Karen Andre, think of your verdict on Bjorn Faulkner. Do you believe he was the kind of man to bow, renounce, and repent? If you do, she's guilty. But if you believe that in this sad, half-hearted world of ours, a man can still be born with life singing in his veins, a scoundrel, a swindler, a criminal, call him anything, but still a conqueror. If you value a strength that is its own motor, an audacity that is its own law, a spirit that is its own vindication, if you are able to appreciate a man that, no matter what mistakes he may have made in form, had never betrayed his essence, his self-esteem. If deep in your hearts you've longed for greatness and for a sense of life beyond the life around you, if you've known a hunger that gray timidity can't satisfy, you'll understand Bjorn Faulkner. And if you do, you'll understand the woman who was his priestess. Who is here on trial in this case? Karen Andre? No. It is you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, who are here on trial. It is you whose souls will be revealed when your decision is rendered.
The district attorney may now conclude the case.
Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, for once, I agree with the defense counsel. Two different types of humanity are opposed in this case, and your verdict will have to depend on which side you choose to believe. You are asked by the defense to take the side of a swindler, a harlot, and a gangster against a man who is the model of social respectability and a woman who is everything the ideal of womanhood has been for centuries. On one side, you see a life of service, duty, and unselfishness. On the other, a steamroller of sensual indulgence and egoistic ambition. I agree with the defense counsel that the judgment on this case will be passed deep within your own souls. If you believe that man is placed on earth for a purpose higher than his own enjoyment, if you believe that love is not all in the bedroom, but in your parlor, in your kitchen, in your nurseries, if you believe that the cozy fireside of a home is still the most sacred ideal a man can aspire to, you will believe that the simple virtue is more powerful than arrogance, and that a man like Bjorn Faulkner would be brought to bow before it. Let your verdict tell us that none shall raise his head too high in defiance of our common standards.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the bailiff will now escort you to the jury room. I shall ask you to consider your verdict carefully. You are to determine whether Karen Andre is guilty or not guilty of the murder of Bjorn Faulkner.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, welcome to the jury room. As soon as you are seated comfortably, we will present you with key moments of testimony from the trial to assist you in your verdict. If you will all kindly direct your attention to the television screen over here, we will begin. Thank you.
I was called to examine the body of Bjorn Faulkner. I found a body mangled to an extreme degree.
Well, he was a bit tight, sir. He wasn't very steady on his feet. Mr. Faulkner and the other gentleman had to just about drag him into the elevator.
She is hoisting a man's body up on the parapet. A man in evening clothes, Faulkner. He is unconscious, no resistance. She pushes him with all her might. He goes over the parapet, down into space.
I found only two enjoyable things on this earth, whose every door was open to me. My whip over the world and Karen Andre.
He had a platinum gown made for her. She wore it over her naked body. And if it burned her shameless skin, she laughed like the pagan she is. And he kissed the burn, viled like tiger.
We were planning to have a modest little home with a bright kitchen and a little flower garden. We'd be so happy there, just the two of us, until we had little ones to take care of.
I had full confidence that my business acumen would have prevented the crash had Faulkner lived.
It is not probable that the letter was forged, but it is possible.
Herr Faulkner shrugged and said lightly, "Oh, commit suicide?" Herr Whitfield looked at him and said, very slowly, "If you do, be sure you make a good job of it."
But do you really think that we're both so low that if something passes us to which one kneels, that we no longer have eyes to see it? I loved her. She loved Faulkner, and that's our only proof.
Bjorn never thought of things as right or wrong. To him, it was only you can or you can't. He always could. To me, it was only he wants or he doesn't.